Now, for more insight, it's a pleasure to welcome to studio Dan Perry, international affairs analyst, author of the newsletter Ask Questions Later, and the former Europe and Middle East editor at the Associated Press, and security analyst Jonathan Regev. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining us. It seems like potentially a pivotal moment in the war. These Palestinian protesters at various locations in Gaza taking a stand against Hamas. Dan, you've been covering this region for a very long time. Your thoughts?
From the beginning, 2007, when Hamas took over Gaza, Israel and Egypt slapped on a blockade, hoping for a rebellion among the Palestinians, assuming there's a rational, logical connection between their suffering and their displeasure with Hamas. That never materialized. The policy has been a complete failure over 17, 18 years for a number of reasons. One of them is that Hamas runs one of the world's most brutal police states. Another is that anger towards Israel was real, genuine, deep, radical hatred of Israel that represents and aligns with Hamas ideology was very real. Now, however irrational and radical you might be, the suffering that the population has endured under Hamas because of Hamas since October 2023 is stupendous. Tens of thousands of people killed, entire cities lying in ruins. I'm not surprised that the opposition that there always was is now stronger. And I wouldn't be indifferent to the courage of these people. It was only a few hundred yesterday, a few thousand today. It doesn't seem like that much in a territory of 2+ million people, but I think we need to remember a few thousand people in Gaza protesting against Hamas, which has a habit of shooting the protesters in the legs or worse, is equivalent to hundreds of thousands in Israel or millions in the US. So this is not insignificant. Will it be enough to cause Hamas to turn tail? Clearly not yet, but if it grows and grows, maybe. The wider context is that Hamas, understanding this is coming, has already made statements to the effect that they're willing to cede power in Gaza. However, they're not willing to disarm. The actual debate right now is going to be over disarmament of Hamas, and that won't be so simple at all. And what needs to happen is tremendous societal pressure among the Palestinians for Hamas essentially to surrender and surrender their arms. And for that to happen, much as I'm pleased to see the defense minister finally saying clear words directed at the Gazans, it would be better if the Arab League and Arab countries said it, and if the Palestinian leadership said it. And it would be better if the Palestinians were given a very clear choice of not just something less horrible if Hamas steps aside, but something genuinely good. And despite that irrationality is very strong at this point in Palestinian society, I hate to say it, not only in that society, but it's strong in Palestine because of the trauma. I think that would have an effect. And if you see polls and everyone senses a reality where 90% of the people want Hamas to disarm, that may be the pivotal moment.
Jonathan, it's quite something not only to see the number of protesters inside Gaza taking a stand against Hamas, as we're discussing. It comes at enormous risk, but also to hear the Israeli defense minister urging Gazans to keep taking a stand against the terror group. Your take?
Yeah, it's true, but I'm not sure it may not have a counter effect, because just like Dan said, even among those protesting, the hatred towards Israel is genuine. They're out there in the streets not because they're going to join the Zionist movement anytime soon, but because they're discontent with Hamas. There's a very clear difference between discontent with Hamas and alliance with Israel. These are two completely different things. And if anybody expects that these protesters will now align with Israel because they're discontent with Hamas, the answer is no. And if anyone thinks that these people will take to the streets because the Zionist Minister of Defense told them to do so, the answer is no. Therefore, it's not as if they will align with Israel. And perhaps even if this brings some kind of a change, even if something changes in Gaza, I think we can perhaps compare it with the change that we saw in Syria. One regime, which was terrible for Israel, is gone. Another regime is in. Is that regime good for Israel? Not so sure. So these people protesting in Gaza, is it remarkable? Absolutely. Is it something that perhaps Israel wants to see happening more and more? Absolutely. Will these people, will they bring the change? Not so sure. And even if they bring the change, is it something that would be favorable for Israel? clearly not sure.
Well, I have to say that regarding the Syria analogy, indeed, we don't know which regime is worse for Israel. But in this case, I am actually confident, which is rare to be confident about something optimistic in the Middle East, that whatever comes after Hamas would indeed be better. It's hard to imagine anything equally as bad. Now, as for Israel Katz and his statements, he made threats. They're not going to listen to him because they're aligning with the Zionists, but they might be listening to his highly credible threats that they will lose more of their homes if they don't get rid of Hamas, with the implication that they will stop suffering if they do.
It's true, but the question is that Israel has been threatening them for a year and a half now, and the evacuation orders, we know that they do listen to that. Whenever evacuation orders were given, they moved away. But will they listen to the Israelis because the Israelis want to see Hamas away? I'll be very happy to see that, but I'm not sure it's going to happen.
The difference maybe is that Hamas is weakened. They may have replenished some of their order of battle, but they don't have the same weapons. They don't have the same wider support in the Arab world. And I think, to a degree, the felicitous protests that we're seeing reflect a declining fear of Hamas. And there's good in that.
There is good in that.
It's one of the most crucial positions in the Israeli security echelon. Benjamin Netanyahu's office has today reportedly started interviewing replacements for Shin Bet head Ronen Bar, who is being dismissed because the Prime Minister no longer trusts him. Dan Perry, your thoughts?
Netanyahu says he doesn't trust the head of the Shin Bet anymore, but the story here is that very many people in the public don't trust Netanyahu to not appoint a head of the Shin Bet who he tells in advance must be loyal to him personally. It's obviously a very bad look when the first Shin Bet chief to be fired is the one who is investigating Netanyahu's inner circle as we speak over the Qatar scandal. But the bigger picture, of course, is that the Shin Bet failed so spectacularly on October 7th that if it was a prime minister and a government that had the trust of the people not to do such a thing as part of a wider authoritarian overhaul, then probably it would go pretty smoothly, despite the fact that there is a war. But at the same time, as the Shin Bet chief is being fired, they're trying to fire the Attorney General of Israel. And she is a very major player in the array of gatekeepers that prevent the executive in Israel from doing whatever it wants, including, arresting anyone named Benita. Like, it's the courts and it's the gatekeepers that keep the rule of law going, and there is a sense that the government is at war with that concept.
Political divisions internally. Meantime, the existential threat remains.
During the past hours, the missile forces, the drone air force, and the naval forces carried out a joint military operation targeting hostile warships in the Red Sea.
I don't know how long the Houthis can go on with this now that we do see a major difference between the Trump and the Biden administration when it comes to dealing with the Houthis. We see quite a strong operation now, which we didn't see before during the Biden administration. Having said that, the Houthis are still firing.
Very briefly, the strategy of the Houthis, Dan, given the ire of the Trump administration and the global coalition. Of course, this is all impacting global shipping.
Well, yeah, I mean, the real issue is less the attacks on Israel, annoying though they may be. I think in the entirety of the war, there was one casualty. Terrible. But what the world sees is that a third of global container traffic has been impeded heading up to the Suez Canal in Egypt, a country that can ill afford it, losing billions in hard currency canal revenues. The Houthis probably cannot be persuaded to cease and desist from their aggression. And if you want to handle this, then they have to be deprived of their ability to fire, both fire missiles at Israel and fire drones and other projectiles at these boats. Essentially, the question is, are the Americans really prepared to continue their 12-day offensive until the Houthis basically surrender? I fear that may require a degree of destruction in Sana'a and in Yemen that will test the indifference of even the Trump administration. But I was such a huge critic of the Biden administration's tolerance of this that I think we can only hope for success on the part of the Americans.
And now we can't really talk about U.S. intelligence without delving a little bit deeper into that embarrassing group messaging mistake earlier in the week in which Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, was added to a U.S. administration group discussing U.S. military plans in Yemen in the latest responses, and there have been many. President Donald Trump dismissing the accidental addition of Jeffrey Goldberg to that group, calling it a glitch. Dan Perry is laughing. Tell us why.
It's a hell of a glitch. It's a terrible mistake, and it puts a journalist in both a wonderful position as a journalist, but also a terrible position because are you a citizen first or a journalist first? And the right answer at a journalism school is you're a journalist, and if you know something, you have to report it. But at all cost, maybe not. I mean, sometimes you have to somehow do a judgment call. He, for the longest time, for days after this glitch was discovered, didn't want to say what was there. He sort of danced around it. He was trying to be a citizen first. I think what worries me more than anything is not the glitch / mistake of Jeffrey Goldberg being added. Mistakes will happen, although at some point incompetence such as we've seen from some quarters of the administration become a worry. But really the foolishness of Secretary Hegseth and going out to the cameras and saying that there were no plans being discussed there. I mean, lying is one thing, but a lie that can be easily exposed and is likely to be immediately exposed is particularly abysmal. And of course, now they've published the actual text of it, The Atlantic has, and it reveals that indeed, shockingly, on this unsecured channel, they were talking about precise plans, exact targets, times in which planes would take off. It is almost literally unbelievable, as in I can hardly believe it happened. And of course then you have Trump talking about the editor of The Atlantic, one of the most respected publications in America, as a hack journalist who's meaningless. I mean, the absurdity just grows ever more curious.
And of course, Pete Hegseth, when he says nobody was texting war plans, you're saying it's very obvious that was not the case. And he knows television and the media all too well, given the fact that he used to be a Fox News host as well. Jonathan Regev, does somebody need to be axed, fired, as Donald Trump used to do so well on television?
I think so. If this is such a big mistake, then yes. As much as I would love to be added to one of those groups, why you're laughing? we are not supposed to be added.
It would be a terrible dilemma for you.
Yeah, it would be a terrible dilemma. But this is not something that's supposed to happen, and it did happen. So yes, someone has to pay the price. Whether it's the National Security Advisor, maybe if he's the one that did the mistake. I think the answer is yes.
Very quickly, should someone be fired?
Yes, of course someone should be fired, specifically the Secretary of Defense for being this way. But I see a bigger problem, which is that everything about how the administration is handling this suggests such an indifference towards public opinion and towards any kind of norms of how to handle such a situation that it is genuinely disturbing. And it means that they're interested in the opinions of no one but their hardcore base. That is not a way for a government to prosper.
Not a great look at all. Dan Perry, international affairs analyst, and security analyst Jonathan Regev, thank you both so much for being here in studio. Appreciate it. Thank you for being part of the Rundown.